Chef Adrienne Laurent thought forcing a quiet delivery woman to cook in front of Manhattan's elite would make him look powerful, but less than 20 minutes later, the entire restaurant would fall into a silence none of them would ever forget. The private dining room inside Laurent House glowed beneath golden chandeliers that reflected softly against polished marble floors and crystal wine glasses worth more than most monthly rent payments in New York City. Wealthy investors, celebrities, and food critics filled the tables, their laughter blending with the low hum of jazz drifting through hidden speakers. At the center of it all stood Adrienne Laurent himself, America's most celebrated celebrity chef, dressed in a spotless white jacket stitched with his name in dark navy thread. At 46, Adrienne had built his reputation on perfection, arrogance, and the ability to make every guest feel as though they were lucky simply to breathe the same air as him. Tonight's exclusive tasting event had been sold out for months, and cameras from several culinary magazines quietly documented every detail of the evening. Servers moved carefully between tables carrying plates arranged like museum art, while Adrienne performed near the open kitchen, explaining ingredients with theatrical confidence. Then the back service door opened quietly, almost unnoticed. Evelyn Carter stepped inside, carrying a cardboard produce crate against her chest. She wore a faded gray coat over a simple blue sweater, her light brown hair tied back loosely. Her appearance so ordinary that most guests barely glanced at her before looking away. At 41, Evelyn carried herself with a softness that made people underestimate her instantly. She lowered the crate beside the kitchen entrance and quietly apologized to a passing server for being in the way. Adrienne noticed her immediately, not because she caused a problem, but because men like Adrienne always noticed people they believed didn't belong. He paused mid-sentence while explaining imported truffle butter to a billionaire investor and slowly looked Evelyn up and down with visible amusement. A faint smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "Interesting," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "I didn't realize delivery staff were staying for dinner service now." A few guests chuckled politely. Evelyn kept her eyes lowered. "I'm just dropping off the produce orders, sir," she answered softly. Adrienne stepped closer, wine glass still in hand. "And yet you're standing there watching my kitchen like you're studying it." More laughter followed. Several phones subtly turned toward the scene. Evelyn glanced toward the line cooks moving quickly behind the stainless steel counters, their motions sharp and disciplined beneath the bright white kitchen lights. For a brief second, something unreadable passed through her eyes. Recognition, memory, maybe even sadness. But it vanished almost instantly. Adrienne noticed the expression and mistook it for intimidation. "Tell me something," he continued, now fully entertaining the room. "Do you cook?" Evelyn hesitated. "A little." The guests laughed harder at the modest answer. Adrienne smiled wider, sensing blood in the water. "A little," he repeated dramatically. "Well, ladies and gentlemen, maybe tonight Laurent House should feature a guest chef." More laughter echoed across the dining room. Even some staff exchanged nervous smiles. Evelyn tightened her grip on the edge of the produce crate. "I should probably get going," she said quietly. But Adrienne wasn't finished. Not tonight. Not in front of an audience. He raised his hand toward the kitchen like a game show host presenting a grand prize. No, he said smoothly. "Stay? In fact, why don't you cook something for us? Unless that sounds too difficult." The room stirred with anticipation. Some guests leaned forward in excitement, while others exchanged uncomfortable looks. Near the back of the kitchen, an older sous chef stopped chopping herbs and watched Evelyn carefully for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Adrienne lifted an eyebrow with a grin sharpened by arrogance. "Come on," he said. "Let's see what the delivery lady can do." And somewhere beneath the warm restaurant lighting, behind Evelyn Carter's calm expression, something old and deeply buried quietly awakened. For a moment, Evelyn Carter did not move. The laughter, drifting through Laurent House, hung in the air like expensive perfume, light and careless, carried beneath the glow of chandeliers and the clinking of crystal glasses. Adrienne Laurent stood waiting with that same polished smile celebrities used when they believed the entire world existed for their amusement. Several guests lifted their phones higher, eager for whatever humiliation might come next. Evelyn slowly set the produce crate down beside the service counter and brushed her hands against her coat sleeves. "I really should leave," she said softly. Adrian tilted his head with exaggerated disappointment. That is unfortunate. I thought maybe tonight we could discover hidden culinary talent among Manhattan delivery workers. More laughter rippled across the dining room. One woman near the front table whispered something to her husband, and both smirked behind raised wine glasses. The younger line cooks avoided eye contact entirely, uncomfortable with where the moment was heading but too intimidated to interfere. Adrian stepped closer to the open kitchen entrance and spread his arms dramatically toward the stainless steel workstations glowing beneath bright overhead lights. "Come on," he called. "Just one dish. Surely you can manage something simple." Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly at her sides. She had spent years learning how to disappear in rooms like this, how to lower her gaze, speak quietly, and leave before arrogant people turned cruelty into entertainment. Usually it worked, but tonight something felt different. Perhaps it was the smell of butter warming on copper pans. Perhaps it was the sharp rhythm of knives striking cutting boards. Or perhaps it was the old ache that returned whenever she stood near a professional kitchen. Adrian mistook her silence for fear. "What is the matter?" he asked loudly. "You were studying the kitchen so carefully a moment ago." A few guests chuckled again. Then a voice quietly broke through the tension. "Chef, maybe let her go." The comment came from an older sous chef standing near the stove, his gray hair tucked beneath a white cap. Adrian barely looked at him. "Relax, Marcus," he replied with a dismissive wave. "The guests are enjoying themselves." Marcus frowned, but said nothing more. He watched Evelyn carefully instead. There was something strange about the way she observed the kitchen. Not overwhelmed. Not confused. Familiar. Evelyn slowly removed her faded gray coat and folded it neatly over the back of a chair beside the service door. Underneath, her blue sweater sleeves were rolled carefully to her wrists, revealing thin scars from old kitchen burns that had long since faded pale against her skin. Marcus noticed them immediately. So did Adrian, though he interpreted them differently. "Well," Adrian said smugly, "at least she has touched a stove before." The room laughed again, but less confidently this time. Evelyn stepped quietly through the kitchen entrance. The moment her shoes crossed the polished tile floor, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere. A few cooks instinctively moved aside without understanding why. The noise of sizzling pans suddenly felt sharper, louder. Even the servers slowed as they passed the kitchen window. Adrian grabbed a clean apron from the counter and tossed it toward her casually. "Try not to burn anything," he said. Evelyn caught the apron smoothly with one hand, a movement so quick and natural that Marcus narrowed his eyes. Adrian did not notice. He was too busy entertaining the dining room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced proudly, "tonight Laurent House presents a very special guest chef experience." Several guests applauded lightly. One food blogger laughed openly while positioning her phone for a better angle. Evelyn tied the apron calmly around her waist, then turned toward the kitchen stations. Her eyes moved once across the knives, the copper pans, the herbs resting on crushed ice, the containers of cream sauce warming near the stove. She said nothing, but Marcus saw it clearly now. The way her posture changed, the way her breathing slowed, the way her entire presence sharpened with quiet control. He had seen world-class chefs enter kitchens with that exact same stillness before service began. And suddenly, for the first time that evening, the old sous chef no longer felt embarrassed for Evelyn Carter. He felt afraid. For Adrian Laurent. The kitchen lights reflected softly across rows of polished steel as Evelyn Carter stood completely still beside the prep counter, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the station. Around her, Laurent House continued moving with the tense rhythm of fine dining service. Pans hissed. Knives struck cutting boards. Servers hurried past carrying trays balanced carefully above their shoulders. Yet beneath the motion, an unfamiliar tension had begun spreading through the kitchen staff. Adrian Laurent leaned casually against the marble pass counter, sipping sparkling water with the relaxed confidence of a man certain he controlled the room. "Well?" he asked with a grin. "Do you need help finding the stove?" Several guests laughed again, though quieter now. Evelyn ignored the comment. Her eyes drifted slowly across the ingredients arranged throughout the kitchen. Fresh thyme, shallots, heavy cream, wild mushrooms resting on crushed ice, ribeye cuts marbled perfectly beneath butcher paper. Then her attention stopped on a small tray tucked near the backstation. White truffles imported from northern Italy. Adrian noticed immediately. "Those are worth more than your monthly paycheck," he said lightly. "Try not to waste them." Evelyn reached for a chef knife resting beside the station. The moment her fingers wrapped around the handle, Marcus froze. Every experienced cook in the kitchen noticed it too, though none of them spoke. People who did not belong in professional kitchens held knives awkwardly, carefully. Evelyn held it like someone greeting an old friend. Balanced, natural, certain. Adrian still failed to notice. He turned back toward the guests, enjoying the spectacle too much to study the details. "Maybe she can make us grilled cheese," one investor joked from the dining room. A few tables laughed politely. Evelyn finally spoke. "What would you like me to cook?" Her voice remained soft, calm, almost detached. Adrian smirked. "You criticized my sauce earlier, remember? Why do not you recreate tonight's signature dish?" He pointed dramatically toward the menu card displayed beneath the chandelier lighting. Pan-seared ribeye with white. Truffle cognac reduction. A difficult dish. Expensive. Complicated. Exactly the kind of challenge designed to guarantee public embarrassment. Marcus quietly glanced toward Evelyn, expecting hesitation. Instead, she nodded once. "All right." Adrian blinked slightly, surprised by how quickly she accepted. "You know the dish?" Evelyn carefully folded a kitchen towel beside the station. "I know food." Something about the answer unsettled Marcus. It unsettled a few others too. The room slowly quieted as phones continued recording. Evelyn stepped toward the stove and lit the burner with a smooth flick of her wrist. Blue flame bloomed beneath the copper pan. Then came the first sound, the clean, controlled rhythm of her knife moving across the cutting board. Thin shallot slices fell with impossible consistency. Not rushed, not flashy, precise. One of the younger cooks stopped plating appetizers entirely just to watch. Adrian's smile faded slightly. Evelyn moved through the station with calm efficiency, reaching instinctively for ingredients before anyone offered them. Butter into the pan. Shallots. Garlic. Fresh thyme crushed gently between her fingertips. The aroma rose almost instantly, rich and balanced. Marcus stared harder now. There were habits chefs developed after decades inside elite kitchens. Tiny movements impossible to fake. The angle of the wrist. The timing between ingredients. The discipline to let silence control the pace instead of panic. Evelyn carried all of it. Adrian crossed his arms tighter. "Interesting," he muttered, though his tone no longer sounded amused. The guests noticed the shift too. Conversations around the dining room softened as more eyes turned toward the open kitchen. Evelyn seared the ribeye with perfect restraint, allowing the crust to develop naturally while spooning butter slowly across the surface. No wasted movement. No hesitation. Just quiet mastery hidden beneath a plain blue sweater and tired eyes. Then Marcus saw something that made the color drain from his face entirely. As Evelyn reached for the truffles, she unconsciously hummed a faint melody under her breath. An old French kitchen tune almost nobody in America knew anymore. Marcus had only heard it once before nearly 20 years ago while training briefly in Paris under one of the greatest chefs in Europe. The same chef whose mysterious protégé had vanished from the culinary world overnight. The old sous chef looked at Evelyn Carter again, this time not with curiosity, but disbelief. And somewhere across the dining room, Adrian Laurent finally stopped smiling completely. The dining room no longer sounded the same. Earlier that evening, Laurent House had buzzed with effortless confidence, with wealthy laughter and polished conversations floating beneath soft jazz music. Now the atmosphere had tightened into something quieter, heavier. Forks rested untouched beside expensive plates. Wine glasses hovered midway to lips. Even the waitstaff moved more carefully, as though afraid to interrupt whatever was unfolding inside the kitchen. Adrian Laurent felt it before he fully understood it. The loss of control. He stood near the marble pass counter with his arms crossed tightly, watching Evelyn Carter move between the stove and prep station with growing unease. Every motion she made carried a level of discipline he recognized instinctively, but refused to admit aloud. She was too calm, too precise, too comfortable inside his kitchen. "Interesting knife work," Adrian finally said, forcing a thin smile back onto his face. "Did you watch cooking videos online or something?" A few guests laughed weakly, though the sound faded quickly this time. Evelyn did not answer. She gently tilted the copper pan, spooning butter over the ribeye while monitoring the heat, without ever glancing directly at the burner. The steak sizzled softly beneath the aroma of thyme and garlic. Then she turned toward the sauce station and paused for the first time since she began cooking. Marcus watched her carefully. Evelyn reached for the cognac bottle beside the reduction pan, then frowned almost imperceptibly. "This sauce is separating," she said quietly. One of the younger line cooks blinked. Adrian immediately scoffed. "Impossible. That reduction has been perfect all night." Evelyn dipped a spoon lightly into the sauce and studied the texture beneath the kitchen lights. "Too much heat after the cream," she replied calmly. "It broke the balance." Adrian stepped forward sharply. "That recipe has earned international awards." Evelyn finally looked at him directly. Her expression remained polite, but there was something unsettling in her eyes now. Not arrogance. Experience. "Awards do not stop dairy from separating," she answered softly. The room went almost completely silent. Marcus lowered his gaze for a second to hide the stunned expression crossing his face. One of the food critics slowly leaned forward in her chair. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but Evelyn had already reached for a clean saucepan. Without rushing, she started rebuilding the reduction from scratch. Shallots, butter, cognac, a measured touch of stock. The movements were economical, almost effortless. No wasted energy, no hesitation. Then came the smell. Richer, warmer, deeper than before. Several guests visibly reacted the moment the aroma drifted through the open kitchen. One investor lowered his phone completely. Another guest quietly muttered, "My God." Adrian's jaw tightened. He tried to regain control of the moment by laughing softly. "Well," he said loudly, "at least she knows how to follow instructions." But nobody laughed this time, because everyone was watching Evelyn now. She shaved thin slices of white truffle over the finished sauce with elegant restraint, then plated the ribeye with a level of balance that looked less like cooking and more like art. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as old memories surfaced from decades earlier in Paris kitchens filled with impossible standards and terrifying brilliance. There had once been whispers about a young American woman training under Chef Luc Moreau, the legendary culinary master who almost never accepted students. The stories claimed her palate was extraordinary, her technique flawless. Then one day she vanished without explanation. Marcus had assumed the rumors were exaggerated. Until tonight, Evelyn placed the finished plate onto the marble counter with absolute calm. The dish looked stunning beneath the kitchen lights, but it was not flashy the way Adrian's food often was. It carried restraint, confidence, purpose, the kind of cooking that did not beg for attention because it already knew its worth. Adrian stared at the plate longer than he intended. His confidence had begun slipping beneath the surface, though pride still refused to let him show fear publicly. "Fine," he said at last. "Let us see if it actually tastes good." But his voice no longer sounded like a man enjoying a joke. It sounded like a man suddenly realizing he might have made a terrible mistake. Adrian Laurent lifted the plate carefully from the marble counter, but for the first time that evening his movements lacked confidence. The warmth rising from the ribeye carried the deep aroma of butter, cognac, and truffle through the dining room, pulling every conversation into silence. Guests who had spent the evening half listening while admiring themselves in crystal reflections were now fully focused on a single plate of food resting in Adrian's hands. Even the musicians near the bar had stopped playing softly between songs. Evelyn Carter removed her kitchen towel calmly and stepped back from the station without saying a word. She did not look toward the guests waiting for a reaction. She did not glance toward the phone still recording her. Instead, she quietly cleaned the edge of the prep counter beside her, as though this were simply another ordinary night. Adrian noticed the gesture immediately, and somehow it unsettled him more than anything else had so far. There was no desperation in her, no need for approval. The older sous chef Marcus watched Adrian carefully now. He had worked beside arrogant chefs his entire life and knew exactly what fear looked like when pride tried to hide it. Adrian carried the plate into the dining room with measured steps, while dozens of eyes followed him beneath the golden chandelier light. He stopped beside the center table where a woman named Vanessa Reed sat waiting. Vanessa was not just another wealthy guest. She was one of the most respected culinary critics in America, a woman whose reviews had built careers and destroyed reputations with equal precision. Adrian had invited her personally, hoping tonight's event would secure his fourth consecutive diamond spoon rating. Vanessa glanced from Adrian to the plate with growing curiosity. "Your mystery chef?" she asked quietly. Adrian forced a smile. Apparently, the tension in his voice did not go unnoticed. Vanessa lifted her fork slowly and cut into the ribeye. The knife moved through the meat effortlessly. Perfect temperature, perfect texture. Around the room, people leaned forward unconsciously. Evelyn remained inside the kitchen, silent beneath the bright lights, her eyes lowered toward the prep counter. Vanessa brought the first bite to her mouth. Then everything stopped. The famous critic froze completely. Her expression changed before she even swallowed. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just stunned. The room held its breath. Adrian's smile weakened. Vanessa lowered the fork carefully onto the plate and stared down at the food as if she had just seen a ghost. "That is impossible," she whispered. Nobody moved. Marcus felt chills crawl slowly up his arms. Adrian tried to laugh lightly. "I assume that means she did not poison you." But Vanessa did not smile. She took another bite slowly, studying every detail now with growing disbelief. "No," she murmured. "This cannot be real." Guests exchanged confused looks. One investor quietly asked, "Is it good?" Vanessa looked up sharply. "Good," she repeated softly. "This is one of the most technically perfect dishes I have tasted in the last 15 years. A wave of stunned whispers spread across the dining room instantly. Several guests turned toward the kitchen window again. Adrian's face drained slightly of color, though he fought to maintain composure. "Well," he replied stiffly, "perhaps beginners get lucky sometimes." Vanessa ignored him completely. Her attention had already shifted back toward Evelyn standing quietly behind the kitchen counter. Then Vanessa noticed something else. The sauce. Her eyes narrowed. She dipped the spoon carefully into the reduction again before tasting it separately. Suddenly, she sat back in her chair with visible shock crossing her face. "No," she said quietly. "There is no chance." Adrian's heartbeat quickened. "What?" Vanessa slowly looked toward Evelyn, now her expression transforming from surprise into recognition. "This reduction technique," she said carefully. "This plating style. The balance of acid and butter. I have only seen this once before." The room had gone completely silent again. Even the servers stood frozen beside their trays. Marcus already knew what was coming next. He could see it in Vanessa's eyes. The same realization he himself had been trying desperately to deny since Evelyn first picked up the knife. Vanessa rose slowly from her chair beneath the chandelier light, never taking her eyes off Evelyn Carter. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked the question that made Adrian Lawrence's stomach suddenly drop like stone. "Who exactly are you?" The question lingered beneath the chandeliers like a sudden crack through polished glass. Nobody in Laurent House moved. Vanessa Reed remained standing beside the center table, her eyes fixed entirely on Evelyn Carter, as though the answer mattered far more than anyone else in the room understood. Adrian Laurent forced a tight smile onto his face and stepped forward quickly before Evelyn could respond. "I think we are becoming a little dramatic," he said with strained amusement. She made one decent plate, but even Adrian no longer sounded convinced by his own words. Vanessa slowly turned toward him. "One decent plate," she repeated softly. "Adrian, this sauce uses a reduction sequence almost nobody practices anymore." She looked back toward Evelyn. Chef Luc Moreau taught that technique personally to only 3 people. The room stirred instantly at the mention of the legendary French chef. Even guests with little culinary knowledge recognized the name. Luc Moreau had been considered one of the greatest chefs in modern history, a perfectionist so selective that entire documentaries had been made about his private kitchens in Paris. Adrian's expression hardened slightly. "You were suggesting this woman trained under Moreau?" Vanessa did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped slowly toward the kitchen entrance, never taking her eyes off Evelyn. "Years ago," Vanessa said quietly, "there was an American prodigy working in Moreau's restaurant." Marcus lowered his head slowly, already knowing the story before she finished. "People said she was extraordinary," Vanessa continued. "Not because she cooked loudly or chased fame. Because she cooked with restraint, precision, emotion." The dining room had become completely still now. Phones remained raised, but nobody whispered anymore. Then one day, Vanessa said, she disappeared. Adrian laughed suddenly, but the sound felt forced and hollow. "This is ridiculous." Evelyn finally spoke. "It was a long time ago." Her voice was soft enough that several guests leaned forward just to hear her clearly. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly at the confirmation hidden inside the sentence. "My God," she whispered. Adrian shook his head immediately. "No, absolutely not." He pointed toward Evelyn with growing frustration. "You expect me to believe that one of the most famous culinary talents in Europe has been delivering produce in Manhattan?" Evelyn looked down at the folded kitchen towel resting beside the prep station. "People leave things behind sometimes," she answered quietly. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. The voice, the humility, the calm. It all matched the rumors from Paris decades earlier. Adrian stared at her in disbelief while panic quietly began replacing his arrogance. Because if Vanessa was right, then every guest in this room had just watched him publicly humiliate someone far more respected than himself. Vanessa stepped closer to the counter now. "Evelyn Carter," she repeated softly, as though trying to unlock an old memory. No, that was not the name. Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the station. For the first time all evening, real emotion flickered across her face. Pain. Vanessa inhaled sharply. "Evelyn Moreau." The room reacted instantly. Several guests gasped quietly. One food blogger nearly dropped her phone. Adrian froze completely. Vanessa stared at Evelyn with open disbelief now. "You married him?" Evelyn gave a small nod. "After culinary school." The silence that followed felt enormous. Luc Moreau had died 8 years earlier after a tragic car accident outside Lyon, France. His death had shaken the culinary world. Internationally, rumors about his widow disappearing afterward had circulated for years, but nobody knew where she went. And now she stood quietly inside a Manhattan kitchen, wearing a faded blue sweater, while the celebrity chef who mocked her struggled to breathe normally. Adrian's face had lost all color. He suddenly remembered every cruel comment he had made that evening. Every laugh, every smug smile. Every guest had witnessed it. Worse, many were still recording. Evelyn untied the apron slowly and folded it neatly beside the station. "I did not come here to embarrass anyone," she said calmly. "I only came to deliver vegetables." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Because at that moment, every person inside Laurent House understood the same thing at once. The quiet woman Adrienne Laurent treated like a joke was not just talented. She was living culinary history, and he had humiliated her in front of the entire world. The silence inside Laurent House no longer felt elegant. It felt crushing. Guests who had arrived expecting entertainment now sat motionless beneath the golden chandelier light, their earlier laughter replaced by visible discomfort. Several people slowly lowered their phones, suddenly aware that the videos they had been recording no longer captured a harmless joke. They captured humiliation. Adrienne Laurent stood frozen beside the center table, staring at Evelyn Moreau as though the world beneath his polished shoes had shifted without warning. Across the dining room, whispers finally began spreading carefully from table to table. "Moreau, Luc Moreau's wife. I thought she disappeared years ago." Vanessa Reed remained near the kitchen entrance, still visibly shaken by the realization unfolding before her eyes. "You were 26 years old when Michelin France called you the most gifted culinary mind of your generation," she said quietly. "Then after Luc died, you vanished completely." Evelyn lowered her gaze toward the folded apron resting beside the prep counter. "I did not want this life anymore," she answered softly. Adrian finally found his voice again, though it sounded weaker now. "If that is true," he said carefully, "then why are you delivering produce?" Evelyn looked toward the kitchen window where snow had begun drifting gently beyond the Manhattan streets outside. "Because life changes," she replied, "and because grief changes people." The room fell silent once more. There was no bitterness in her voice, no attempt to impress anyone. That somehow made the moment heavier. Marcus leaned quietly against the counter, watching Adrian unravel in real time. For years, Adrian had built an empire around recognition, status, and carefully controlled attention. But Evelyn carried something far more dangerous than fame. Authentic greatness. The kind that did not need to announce itself. One of the investors near the front table slowly shook his head in disbelief. "I studied under Chef Moreau's documentary program in college," he murmured. "People said his wife could taste flaws in sauces before ingredients fully blended." Vanessa gave a faint nod. She was considered a genius. Adrian swallowed hard. The word echoed painfully inside his chest. Genius. Not influencer. Not celebrity. Not television personality. Genius. Everything he had spent years pretending to be suddenly felt fragile beside the quiet woman standing calmly in his kitchen. Then one of the younger servers approached timidly, holding a phone in trembling hands. "Chef," she whispered nervously to Adrian. "The live stream clips are already online." Adrian's stomach tightened instantly. "What?" The server looked pale. "People are sharing the videos everywhere." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. He already understood exactly what was happening outside these walls. Millions of viewers loved watching arrogant people humiliate strangers, but they loved watching arrogance collapse even more. Adrian grabbed the phone from the server's hand and stared at the screen. The clips had spread across social media within minutes. The captions were brutal. "Celebrity chef humiliates culinary legend without recognizing her." The comments multiplied faster than he could process them. Some defended Evelyn. Others condemned Adrian openly. Several users had already identified Vanessa Reed in the footage, confirming the story publicly. Adrian's face drained completely of color. His perfect evening was collapsing in real time before the entire internet. He slowly looked back toward Evelyn. "I did not know," he said quietly. It was the first honest sentence he had spoken all night. Evelyn met his eyes for a long moment. "That is the problem," she answered gently. "You decided who I was before asking." The words landed harder than any public insult could have. Around the dining room, people lowered their eyes uncomfortably. Because suddenly it was not just Adrian being exposed. It was everyone who laughed with him earlier. Everyone who enjoyed the spectacle because they assumed the quiet woman deserved it somehow. Vanessa stepped closer to Evelyn carefully. "The culinary world thought you disappeared forever," she said. Evelyn gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe I needed silence more than applause." Outside the restaurant windows, snow continued falling softly across Manhattan, while inside Laurent House nobody seemed capable of speaking anymore. Because for the first time that night, the room was finally beginning to understand the difference between fame and dignity. The atmosphere inside Laurent House had transformed completely. Earlier that evening, the restaurant had felt untouchable, a palace of luxury built around Adrian Lawrence's reputation and ego. Now the polished marble floors, golden chandeliers, and crystal glasses seemed strangely hollow beneath the weight of public embarrassment settling over the room. Guests avoided looking directly at Adrian. Some stared down at their untouched meals, while others quietly refreshed social media feeds that continued exploding with footage from the livestream. The headlines were spreading faster every minute. "Celebrity chef publicly humiliates legendary widow of Luc Moreau." Culinary icon recognized after being mocked in Manhattan restaurant. Adrian Lawrence's hands trembled slightly as he handed the server's phone back. He had spent years building his image carefully through television appearances, interviews, and curated perfection. But reputation was fragile in the digital age. One moment of arrogance could destroy years of branding overnight. And deep down, Adrian knew something even worse than the public backlash had happened tonight. He had revealed who he truly was when he believed Evelyn Moreau had no status to protect her. Across the room, Vanessa Reed remained seated now, still studying Evelyn with visible fascination. "You know," she said quietly, "after Luke died, dozens of restaurants offered you partnerships worth millions." Evelyn nodded faintly. "I remember. But you disappeared instead." Evelyn glanced toward the snow falling softly outside the restaurant windows. Cooking stopped feeling beautiful after he was gone. Her answer carried no drama, only exhaustion buried beneath years of silence. Several guests lowered their eyes again. One older woman near the back table quietly wiped tears from beneath her glasses. Even Marcus looked away briefly, giving Evelyn the privacy of dignity in a moment that could easily have become spectacle. Adrian slowly approached the kitchen entrance, his polished shoes suddenly sounding too loud against the floor. "Mrs. Moreau," he began carefully. Evelyn interrupted softly. "Evelyn is fine." The correction somehow made him feel even smaller. Adrian swallowed hard. "Evelyn," he repeated quietly, "I owe you an apology." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because for the first time all evening, Adrian Laurent sounded sincere. He looked around the dining room at the guests, the phones, the cameras, then back toward Evelyn standing calmly beneath the bright kitchen lights. "I judged you the second you walked through that door," he admitted. "I assumed your clothes determined your worth." I assumed being quiet meant you had nothing important to say. His voice tightened slightly. And I humiliated you because I thought it would entertain people. The room remained completely silent. Evelyn studied him for several seconds before responding. You were not trying to entertain people, she said gently. You were trying to feel superior. The truth in the sentence hit harder than any insult. Adrian lowered his eyes immediately. Around the room, several guests shifted uncomfortably because they recognized themselves in her words too. Wealth had made many of them careless, important, distant from ordinary people. And tonight they had laughed at a quiet woman simply because they believed she did not belong beside them. Vanessa slowly nodded to herself as though witnessing something rare. Real humility. Not performative. Earned. Adrian took a slow breath. I cannot undo tonight, he said quietly. But if there is anything I can do to make this right, I will. Evelyn looked toward the prep station where the folded apron still rested neatly beside the stove. There is something, she answered softly. Adrian looked up quickly. Anything. Evelyn's eyes moved calmly across the restaurant. The young cooks here, she said. Teach them that food is not about power. Not about applause. Not about making people feel small. She paused briefly. A kitchen should feed dignity, not ego. Marcus closed his eyes for a second as the words settled over the room. Even Vanessa looked visibly moved now. Adrian stood completely still beneath the chandelier light, absorbing every syllable. Then, slowly he nodded. I understand. But the truth was harsher than that. He was only beginning to understand. Because greatness had walked quietly into his restaurant wearing a faded blue sweater, and he almost missed it entirely. The snow outside Manhattan had grown heavier by the time Evelyn Morrow finally reached for her gray coat near the service entrance. Inside Laurent House, nobody seemed ready to move yet. The dining room remained wrapped in the strange stillness that follows moments people know they will remember for the rest of their lives. Crystal glasses sat untouched. Half-finished meals cooled beneath chandelier light. Even the kitchen staff stood quieter than before, as though something far bigger than a dinner service had unfolded inside those walls tonight. Evelyn slipped one arm gently into her coat sleeve, while Marcus approached slowly from the prep station. The older sous chef hesitated before speaking, almost like a student standing before a master. Chef Moreau, he said softly. Evelyn gave him a small, tired smile. Please, she answered. Just Evelyn. Marcus nodded respectfully. I trained in line for 6 months when I was younger, he admitted. I heard stories about you. There. Evelyn looked down briefly. Most stories become kinder with time. Marcus shook his head faintly. Not those stories. The old sous chef glanced toward the spotless copper pans hanging above the kitchen line. People said your husband trusted your palate more than his own. For the first time that evening, real emotion crossed Evelyn's face openly. Not pride. Grief. Quiet and enduring. Luke believed food should comfort people, she said softly. He hated kitchens filled with ego. Adrian Laurent stood several feet away, listening silently. Earlier that night, he would have interrupted, defended himself, redirected attention back toward his reputation. But something inside him had shifted beneath the weight of humiliation and truth. For once, he simply listened. Vanessa Reed slowly approached Evelyn as well, holding a business card carefully between her fingers. The culinary world is going to want interviews, she said gently. Books, television appearances. Every major restaurant in America will call by morning. Evelyn glanced at the card but did not take it. I know. Vanessa studied her face carefully. And Evelyn looked toward the dining room, where wealthy guests now avoided eye contact with her out of embarrassment rather than superiority. I spent years chasing applause, she answered quietly. Then I lost the person who made success meaningful. The room fell silent once more. Snow drifted softly against the tall restaurant windows while distant traffic lights reflected across wet Manhattan streets outside. Adrian finally stepped forward carefully. Evelyn, he said quietly. She turned toward him. His voice carried none of the arrogance from earlier now. Would you ever consider coming back to the culinary world? Evelyn looked at him for a long moment before answering. I never left cooking, she said softly. I only left fame. The simplicity of the sentence seemed to strike everyone at once, because they suddenly understood something uncomfortable about themselves. Most people in the room had spent their lives confusing recognition with worth, wealth with dignity, noise with greatness. But Evelyn Morrow had walked away from international fame. and still carried more grace in silence than most people carried with applause. Adrian lowered his eyes slowly. "I understand now," he murmured. Evelyn gave a faint smile filled with sadness and kindness at the same time. "No," she replied gently. "You are starting to." Then she picked up the small produce invoice still resting beside the service counter. Several guests looked confused. One billionaire investor blinked in disbelief. "You still want payment for the vegetables?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "Business is business." A few quiet laughs finally broke through the tension, but this time they carried warmth instead of cruelty. Marcus walked her toward the back in trance while the kitchen staff silently stepped aside for her to pass. No applause followed her. No dramatic farewell. Somehow that made the moment feel even more powerful. Evelyn paused briefly at the doorway as cold winter air drifted softly inside. Then she looked back one final time toward the restaurant that had mocked her only an hour earlier. "A kitchen tells the truth about people," she said calmly. Eventually, the room went silent again. And as Evelyn Moreau disappeared into the falling Manhattan snow, every person inside Lauren House understood the same lesson at once. The world often notices the loudest person in the room first. But real greatness rarely needs to raise its voice.